Chapter 10. The Long Epiphany. On June 5th, 1968, just after midnight, while I was working at Bimbo's 365 Club in San Francisco with Lana Cantrell, Robert Kennedy was shot dead at the Ambassador Hotel down in L.A. I told him I wasn't going on for the second show. They, whoever they were, Bimbo, I guess, insisted that I go on. No way. In fact, I decided as I watched the coverage through the night that I wasn't going back the next night either. Fuck Bimbo. Then the Chicago Convention police riot happened, and that brought people down on one side or the other with more firmness than they might have had before. I was no exception. It's funny, but I never find myself responding very much to events of great magnitude. There's a part of me that knows that's exactly what's supposed to happen. I will sometimes marvel at the timing or circumstances or setting or the individuals involved. Weird is the word that occurs to me most often. That's fucking weird. Weird, but never unexpected. I didn't respond with rage to any of what was happening in 1968. Dr. King's murder in April was depressingly predictable. There was a sinking feeling that something good was ebbing away and being encouraged in that direction by the usual forces. The establishment was winning. Its war, its assassins, its secret government. And that fact overpowered and debilitated me more than it enraged me. I've always been the kind of person, whether it comes from being half shanty, half lace-curtain Irish, I don't know, who needs to be changed, rather than instigating change myself. I could never make life-changing decisions in a split second. I'm always open to change, but I need to have it happen in a natural, organic, timely fashion. I always say that everything in nature works very, very slowly. Okay, what about a volcano? Well, an eruption may seem like split-second drama, but it's actually the end result of a long process that's gone on for years far below the Earth's surface. My change, when it came, was like that, drawn out over several years, then exploding in a series of eruptions. By now, 1968 and 69, everything about my comedy seemed by rote. On the Smothers Brothers show, where I remember feeling at home, feeling we'd taken over, where even the things about the show that were the same, such as blocking and standing around like a dick for hours, had a different flavor. Even there, on the only comedy show that was actually taking a stand against the war, I did The Indian Sergeant. Why the fuck didn't I sit down a month before and write something daring for Tommy Smothers? It was a particularly low point. All these fucking stupid TV shows with all that lighting shit, meaningless banter, all that garbage, all that wasted time and energy. My brilliant act, which was doing so well, had nowhere to go. I was writing and performing material that went around in circles, media material, taking off on media form, television about television. And while I was powerfully attracted to the life my rock and folky friends led, as a comedian, how did I go about leading that? There were very few counterculture comedy centers. One terrific group in San Francisco called The Committee, who'd been on Smothers with me, but that was about it. I felt inadequate compared to an outfit like The Committee. I felt I'd somehow stained myself with this middle-class show business shit. And however much kinship I had with the counterculture, it brought up again the eternal dilemma of longing to belong, but not liking to belong, even though the group I wanted to belong to now were non-belongers. Maybe it wasn't belonging that I longed for so much as being able to fulfill my proper role. I wasn't doing my job. I wasn't using my mind to produce the external evidence of my inner state. I was superficially skimming off the top with these mild and passable parodies. The very fact that they were parodies is telling. There was nothing of me in them. I looked at what my friends were doing, the music they were making, the doors they were opening, the stands they were taking, the changes they were acknowledging and instigating. Then I looked at the people in TV studios and nightclubs where I did my superficially skimming act, mostly for the parents of the people I admired. I felt like a traitor to my generation. George Carlin has become a showbiz mystery. One of the very best young contemporary clowns, he had a splendid comic spirit, a fresh new outlook on comedy, got the top TV bookings, has been considered for several terribly remunerative TV talk show chairmanships. His material was attractive to teenagers, college kids, and mature marrieds. His records sold friskily, and all seemed right in his straight future. Carlin now seems an artistic dropout. His clothes, incensed hangdog demeanor, long ponytail-style hairdo, grubby pants, a totally unwashed, shambling, savagely apologetic aspect, as if speaking straight from a hobo jungle, combine in his new style. Essentially no style at all, beyond a belligerent, truculent statement. Thus spake Jack O'Brien, the self-described voice of Broadway, in 1973, following a rowdy concert I'd done at the Westbury Music Fair in Long Island. I couldn't have been happier with his words if I had written them myself. Yes, Jack, you dopey old bigot, you hit the nail right on the head. How had I become an unwashed, shambling, savagely apologetic hobo with grubby pants and an incensed hangdog demeanor? Well, it hadn't been easy. I think it all began with that long ponytail-style hairdo. I once said I always had long hair, only I used to keep it inside my head. But letting it come out where people could see it was a drawn-out process. Looking back on it, I'm not even sure where and when it began. It was a barely conscious decision, almost as if the hair decided to come out of its own accord. My hair had a mind of its own. Terrible things were happening to me, but because of them my life began to change. In the fall of 1969, I was fired from the Frontier Hotel in Vegas, where I had an extremely lucrative 2-year deal for saying the word ass. I had been working into my act a little short about, I got no ass, you might notice. I go right from the shoulders to the heels, like most Irish guys. No ass. When I was in the service, black guys used to see me in the showers and say, Hey man, where's your ass at? Stud got no ass. That was it. They fired me, closed me after the very first show. Being fired from the Frontier for saying ass, a harbinger, don't you love that word, of all that was to come. Then there was acid. I know exactly when I first did acid. It was in October 1969, while I was playing a major, now long-defunct jazz club in Chicago called Mr. Kelly's. Next to my record of that booking, which was otherwise uneventful, is written in a trembling hand the word acid. Actually, in the course of a 2-week gig, I did acid multiple times, maybe 5, maybe 10. After the first couple of trips, your numeracy tends to decline. Fuck the drug war. Dropping acid was a profound turning point for me, a seminal experience. I make no apologies for it. Most people should do acid. It should be sold over the counter. Acid finally moved me from one place to the other, allowed change to take place. Change that had been rumbling underground all this time, but which I still needed to have happen to me rather than initiate. I suppose I did initiate it by dropping the stuff, but I couldn't know what would transpire. At least I had the illusion that change had happened to me, rather than through me. Suddenly all the conflict that had been tormenting me between the alternative values and straight values began to resolve. But this radically different, utterly changed, re-imprinted, reprogrammed person had to now go play the Copacabana in New York. The Copa was the quintessential place I did not belong. I'd only agreed to do it, long before the acid, when management said, "It's Christmas. Oliver is headlining." Oliver was a pseudo-folkie who had a #1 song. There'll be a lot of people who don't normally go to a place like the Copacabana, so you'll get a younger TV audience crowd. You'll be okay. The Copa was owned by Jules Podell, an old-line, semi-gangster type with this big pinky ring that he would tap loudly on the table when he didn't like something. So I did my act. Indian sergeant, hippy-dippy weatherman, wonderful wino, all the standard stuff, but less convincingly than ever. Sometimes midway in the show, not having my heart in it, with Podell sitting out there, I'd start in on the Copa itself. These dumps went out of style in the 1940s and they forgot to close. Tap, 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 tap. Some nights I'd lie down on the floor under the piano and describe its underside. There are vertical and diagonal pieces of wood with little nails in them, and one of them says, New York City 00-601. Or, still lying on the floor, I'd describe the ceiling of the club, unfavorably. Another time, I brought the Yellow Pages on stage. I'm now going to read from Upholsterers, which I did. There'd be a few embarrassed, unbelieving laughs. Perhaps there were some people in the audience who'd heard of Dada and thought it was Dada, but not a lot. And always from the table out there in the darkness. Tap, 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 tap. This went on for 3 entire weeks, the tirades and Dada shit, alternating with the not even half-hearted performances. Every night I would ask to be fired on stage. I would say, "Please fire me." Podell wouldn't do it. Just the tapping. Then, on my next to last night, during the first show, in the final minutes of my final piece, they slowly turned the lights down on me. Ever so slowly, as if the sun was setting. Then just as slowly they turned my volume off. At the end, I was standing on stage, in the dark, in total silence. In a way, it was kind of perfect. The lights had gone down on that part of my life. It was January 6, 1970, the Feast of the Epiphany. A great start to a watershed year. I'd now been fired from 2 of the supposedly more prestigious and certainly more high-visibility mainstream locations in the country. And while the frontier could be written off as a temporary lapse, a minor infraction, I'd flaunted my disgust and conflict and unhappiness every night for 3 weeks in the media capital of the world. I got at least one good review from a very unexpected source, my mother. She wrote me a letter enclosing reviews of a Samuel Beckett play they'd just seen. This is what devout Catholic Eisenhower Republican Mary had to say to her wayward son about his latest developments. Dear George, I should be on the checkout line at the supermarket, but I must say these words to you. Please read these reviews. You will someday be a Beckett or a Joyce, or maybe a Bernard Shaw. You seem to have their kind of disturbance. Someday you will release what you have down inside of you, and it will be listened to and heard. They condemn you for idolizing Lenny Bruce. How little they really know what you see in his courage, sincerity, and daring. Please, George, insist on being yourself. Don't let anyone change you or silence you. I am so hungry for a heart-to-heart with you. Why have I got this restlessness, this groping for answers which I sometimes feel I have passed on to you? Do you follow me, George? Why can't I quiet this undisciplined questioning of what goes on around us? Why am I caught up by it? Wow! Had Mary been dropping a little acid, too? There was no turning back. Of its own volition, hair was sprouting out all over me. On the talk shows that I did, Steve Allen, for example, or Della Reese. I began to be quite open about my changes and new values and what I saw as the government's omissions and inconsistencies. Virginia Graham had a terrific show which I guested 4 or 5 times. She was a great character. Didn't give a shit what people thought and loved to stir things up. She was always saying sweetly, "Let's you two fight." In other words, why don't you two guests of mine rip each other to shreds? I did once. I ripped up Representative Bob Dornan, the red-headed maniac from Orange County, when he'd just become a congressman. He talked about these hippies desecrating the flag and the violence of people who are blowing up math buildings, and protested about protesters getting violent. So I called him on it. Wait a minute. A flag is supposed to represent everything that a country does. It doesn't only represent the good things. If you burn the flag, you're burning the flag for what you perceive to be the bad things the country has done. It's only a symbol. It's only a piece of cloth. And the violence of the left is symbolic. The injuries are not intended. The violence of the right is real, directed at people, designed to cause injuries. Vietnam, nuclear weapons, police out of control are intentional forms of violence. The violence from the right is aimed directly at people, and the violence from the left is aimed at institutions and symbols. I got him mad as hell. It was a nice turning around of his own words, which was great. Take that, you cocksucker. David Frost was great, too. I did 2 of those. First time, John Lennon was on, and I got bumped because Lennon went long. Backstage, I got talking to Lennon, and I guess I wanted to tell him something because I ended up asking, "How can I call you?" So he gave me his number. I still have it in his own handwriting. John Lennon and Yoko. Someplace on Bank Street. I'm really proud of that. That goes along with my Charlie Parker autograph. Second time I did a whole show, and Frost was good. He gave you questions so you could take off and wail for a while. The other change that took place was my starting to play coffee houses and folk clubs. There wasn't yet much new material, but what I did was simply tell about the changes and make the point that I had to stop working from the surface of my brain and get into the middle of my gut. Talk about who I was and how I felt. The coffeehouse ethos lent itself to that first-person, quasi-confessional approach. And this was a crucial difference because talking directly to the audience rather than performing for them in character as I always had would soon evolve into a completely new kind of material. But mainly I had to explain myself to me. What had been pulling at me all this time, dragging me away from the old approach and toward the new, was the lack of my voice in my work, the absence of me in my act. I would say, I wasn't in my act, I was all these other people. And I would introduce them all, the old familiar characters, one by one, to make the point. I was stumbling across the difference between being an entertainer and being an artist. Even more basically, I needed to authenticate myself by hearing what I was thinking said out loud. The best way I know to clarify my thinking is to hear and see what I think I'm thinking. Because however clear it may seem to you internally, it's never clear exactly what it is you think until you speak and hear the words. You are your own first-night audience. More disasters, at least in the conventional sense, were ahead. At the end of August, I was to return to the scene of my former crimes at the Frontier Hotel in Vegas. I didn't test the willingness of the audience for several weeks. I was playing with the Supremes. But then came a night when I threw in a thought about the double meanings of that fine little word, shit. And, by extension, about my own previous problems with the Frontier. I said, I don't say shit. Down the street, Buddy Hackett says shit. Red Fox says shit. I don't say shit. I smoke a little of it, but I don't say it. And I'm off onto something else. When I leave the stage, I'm informed that I've been relieved of my duties. A spokesman for the hotel later told the papers that I had apparently been unsatisfied with the reaction of the audience and began belaboring them with four-letter words. We estimate that at least 70% of the show was offensive. They closed me down 5 days early, paid me pro rata. I was making $12,500 a week at the time, and canceled me forever. That was it for the foreseeable future for George Carlin and Las Vegas. But what was in conventional terms a third major professional disaster was in fact another turning point. The experience became the first line in the routine that kicked off the FM side of my next album and was in many ways its trademark, the shit routine that went by the name of shoot. Shit's a nice word, friendly, happy word, handy word. The middle class has never really been into shit as a word. Not really comfortable. You'll hear it around the kitchen if someone drops a casserole. Oh, shit. Look at the noodles. Oh, shit. Don't say that, Johnny. Just hear it. Sometimes they say shoot, but they can't kid me. Shoot is shit with 2 O's. There's a clear line of evolution between shoot and the 7 words. The piece grew out of a desire to talk about language standards and the inconsistency in them. So by being authentic about what had happened to me, I found a way into a new comedy that was accurate and natural. The hair and the beard, which had to have been a factor in the firing, a clear signal in divided times that I had come down on one side of the Kulturkampf, was getting longer. The hair was certainly part of the next and final disaster. Daily Variety for Monday, November 30th, 1970, carried the bare bones of the story. Comic George Carlin was canceled and asked to leave Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, Playboy Club after the audience got ugly during his second show Saturday night. Management said it feared for his safety. It was his shtick about materialism in American society, press censorship, poverty, Nixon Agnew, and the Vietnam War that apparently incensed the late-night crowd. Club manager said Carlin insulted the audience directly and used offensive language and material. Reacting to his statements about poverty, one woman heckled, "You don't know anything about poverty. We don't have any in this country." A comment about going through Cambodia to get out of Vietnam brought the retort, "How do you know? You never been shot at." Club manager said comic would have been in danger if he'd gone anywhere in the audience. The booking at Lake Geneva was scary. When the guy heckled me about never having been shot at, the only thing that went through my head was, does he have a gun? People were yelling things like, "Where's the old George Carlin?" and calling for the check. Soon it became the entire audience, maybe 200 straight, tight, asshole-looking Wisconsin Saturday night out people. Getting up, walking out, fingers being waved at me. It was something out of a movie. I finished whatever time I felt they had to pay me for, and in a ridiculous act of bravado, walked out through the audience, although there was clearly a wing on stage. The Lake Geneva Playboy Club was a self-contained resort. I would have to spend the night in a hotel room in the compound, alongside many of the people from that disgusted, hostile audience. Management not only sent me a telegram canceling me, but said, "We cannot guarantee your safety if you remain on the premises. We're asking you to leave." Apparently, people had been going to the front desk and asking for my room number. So I thought, fine, I'm only 90 miles from Chicago and Hugh Hefner's mansion. Hef is probably home. Freedom of speech is involved. Hef says he cares about that. Hef will back me up, and I'll get my fucking money. I drive down to Chicago, go to the mansion, and Hef is there with Bill Cosby playing pinball. I tell Hef the whole story, and he says, "Well, there are two Hefs, George. One of them, sitting in that audience, would have loved that material. The other Hef," and here he was paraphrasing Lenny, "you gotta do business with these assholes." So, I was finally finished with that fairy tale, too. There was another side to this time of discovery. Acting on principle costs money. In spite of all the things that had been going on in my head throughout 1970, Brenda and I had arranged to buy a house in Calabasas, our first home ever in suburban Los Angeles. All that stuff ran away. The house, that dream, just disappeared. It was a wrenching thing for Brenda. We had to leave the house in Beverly Hills. We were renting from a CBS executive and moved back to the apartment complex we lived in when we first came to L.A. We moved back down in the world. From there we went to Venice, which back then, long before gentrification, was a very run-down, hippie-ridden neighborhood. We took a little apartment on Pacific Avenue as a conscious way of entering the counterculture. I think Brenda was afraid of how I was, of the things I now believed and where I was going. I remember a resistance in her, whether it was just body language or facial expressions or some retort, even when I was just reacting to something on TV. It produced a lot of fear and apprehension in her. When I got angry with her, I would attack her for being a middle-class, Midwestern, Protestant, conventional thinker, trapped and bound by those values. And there was always my pot smoking. It left her out. She never smoked pot, and the few times she did, she didn't like it. And pot is a club. When the pot smokers are off laughing in the corner and you're sitting there drinking your Cuddy Mist, that's devastating. This wasn't a political clash as much as a behavioral one. What I was saying was identified in her mind with unstable and dangerous people. There wasn't a chasm between us at this time, but certainly a good-sized crevice. I felt trapped by my commitment to things I wanted for Brenda and Kelly versus the things I wanted for myself. I never felt, gee, if I could only get away from this woman. I do remember thinking, gee, if I could just get her to stop drinking, some of this could begin to change. But that was selfish because here I was full of pot and my own intake of alcohol. Right in the midst of this, as my hair and beard began to sprout and the break was becoming irreversible, Brenda found out she was pregnant again. We had no money. This time I said, we can't do it. And very reluctantly, Brenda agreed. It was 1970. Well before Roe v. Wade. We had about $700 in the bank. I took it out. I drove Brenda to Burbank to the parking lot of a bank. The woman met her, blindfolded her, and drove her to an apartment house somewhere else in Burbank. She said there was just a room with a table and a bucket. They did the abortion. Then she was blindfolded again, driven back to the lot, and I took her home. I can't begin to imagine now what she went through because of that. In addition, I was so focused on what was happening to me and where it would lead that I never actually sat down with her and explained myself, the physical and mental changes I was going through. Eventually, she asked me what the fuck was going on, and I said, I'm going to be the person on the outside that I've been on the inside my whole life. And she looked at me as if she was looking at another guy, as if she no longer knew who this man was. But I couldn't change course now. I'd begun in earnest to drive toward a new way of doing material, in which I would authenticate what I thought and felt by talking directly to the audience. I had a set of beliefs and values that gave me all the ironic contrast I needed to create art. I was rediscovering the us versus them dynamic from my old neighborhood and the underdog attitudes I grew up with. My sense of us versus them had been alive and well on the streets around Columbia and in the Air Force, where I rejected everything they put on me. But it had been submerged when I got into the nightclubs and the smothering chatter of television. The only thing that had kept it alive had been pot, which gave me an internal playground where the rebel in me had a place to look at society and disagree. Now I had to redirect that energy outward to the real world, rediscover why they were our enemies. I had ways of stating this cleverly. The key, it seemed to me, was simply to tell the truth about where I came from, what had shaped me, made me a class clown, how I had become what I was now. There was an autobiographical part to this that went along with that new first-person approach. Have you noticed? Know what I think? Do you remember? I would no longer deal with subjects that were expected of me in ways which had been determined by others. I would determine the ways. My own experiences would be the subject. I went into myself. I discovered my own voice, and I found it authentic. So apparently did the audiences in the coffee houses I was now playing. And while I was back to making no money, when they laughed, now it felt great. I was getting votes of confidence for the path I had taken. They were reaffirming something that I felt and now was able to think through as well as feel. It meant I was right, which strengthened my resolve to carry this through. The means was my new album, FM and AM, the premise being that there had been an old AM George Carlin, I no longer was, from whom a new FM George Carlin was emerging. FM radio representing the underground and counterculture, and AM the old-fashioned and square. Not that the material on the AM side was old-fashioned and square. Actually, I thought it was too good to waste. But it clearly demonstrated where I had once been and defined where I was now going. Far underground, the volcano began to rumble.